Well, thank you very much, everyone. I mean, a lot's already been said, and with far greater eloquence than I'm able to muster. But if you'll allow me a couple of remarks. It's no secret that Harpal and I, my father and I, had our differences, both personal and political, and we come from a family where the personal is political and the political is personal. And furthermore, we come from a political tradition where the 5% of things you disagree on are far more important, far more interesting than the 95% of things you agree on. Nonetheless, we had a good relationship, we enjoyed each other's company, we could talk about anything and everything, and we did. And I learned a great deal from Harpal, and I think there are a few tenets of his political identity and his political legacy that I would seek to uphold, and I think other people in this room would seek to uphold. The first of them is Harpal was a militant, consistent, uncompromising, resolute anti-imperialist at a time and in a place where there wasn't enough anti-imperialism, where the movement was dominated, as has been said already, by opportunism and by social chauvinism. Harpal, his entire political life, which was his entire adult life, made common cause with the oppressed masses suffering under the jackboot of imperialism in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific. Starting with, as Ranjit has mentioned, with the demonstrations in relation to the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in Delhi in 1961, and continuing on through his whole political life. He made common cause with the people of Vietnam, with the people of Indonesia, with the people of China, with the people of Palestine, of Syria, of Libya, of Cuba, of Venezuela, of Nicaragua, of Bolivia, of Mozambique, of Zimbabwe, of Angola, South Africa, Guinea-Bissau. And there were times when those anti-imperialist positions were sort of more or less socially acceptable, at least within the left. There have been times when it's been more or less okay to stand up for Palestinian national rights. There were times when it was more or less socially acceptable to stand up against the Vietnam War, as I said, to qualify, at least within the left. But it was never acceptable to stand with the Libyan Jamahiriya against NATO regime change in 2011. It was never acceptable to stand with the Syrian Arab Republic against a proxy war from 2011 again. It was never acceptable to support the Zimbabwean national liberation struggle, and even worse, to support the Zimbabwean land reform in the 1990s, where land was finally redistributed to the indigenous African people. These positions didn't win one friends. They didn't help you get promoted at work. They could result in alienation. They could potentially result in you losing your job. But Harpal was not a follower of fashion. He was someone who believed in being true to one's principles. He is someone who believed that the truth will win out in the end. And to borrow the immortal words of Comandante Fidel Castro, history has absolved him and will continue to absolve him. The second component I want to talk about of Harpal's political legacy is Harpal was someone who had the fortitude and the courage to call himself what he was, which was a communist, in a time when it was not easy to do that. Again, calling yourself a communist is not something that's going to get you invited to respectable dinner parties, which is sort of counterintuitive in a sense, because, if you think about what the vision of communists is, it's for a classless society. It's for a society free from the exploitation of one human being by another. It's for a society free from the oppression of one social group by another. It's for a vision of people living in peace based on comradeship, collectivity, and cooperation. Nonetheless, we live in a social context where capitalist cultural hegemony has turned communism and communists into dirty words. But Harpal was someone who lived by his beliefs, regardless of whatever the personal consequences of that might be. And I'm absolutely convinced that he had no regrets about that. I'm absolutely convinced that his dying wish wasn't that he wished he'd pretended he wasn't a communist. Thirdly, and the last element that I'd like to talk about is that Harpal resolutely and consistently defended the history of the working class globally, in particular, the record of the working class in power, meaning that he supported actually existing socialism, be it in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Laos, in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or elsewhere. In the face of never-ending, relentless, vicious attack on that history in the media, in the education system, and so on. The mainstream narrative has managed to turn the Soviet Union into this dystopia. If you speak to someone who hasn't meaningfully studied it, they think that the Soviet Union, the whole Soviet experience, was utterly awful, never mind the fact that this is the place where socialism was built for the first time, that a backward country characterized by crushing poverty became the second largest economy in the world, where literally every single citizen had food on the table and a roof over their head and enjoyed a dignified life, had access to arts, had access to education, had access to healthcare, had access to culture, had access to libraries. Soviet socialism built up a country to a sufficient strength that it was able to win the Second World War. It was able to defeat German Nazism. It was able to liberate Europe. It was able to liberate the concentration camps. So we all owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the heroic Soviet people. Mainstream history has turned that around, has turned it into a dystopia based in no small part on this sort of systematic character assassination of Joseph Stalin. And they've done a similar thing in relation to China. They've turned China into a dystopia based in no small part on on a character assassination campaign against Mao Zedong. But China's the largest socialist country. The lives of the Chinese people have been utterly transformed beyond all recognition. In 1949, when the People's Republic of China was founded, the life expectancy was around 35 years old. It's now 79 years old. It's surpassed that of the United States. Feudalism has been comprehensively dismantled. And for those of you who've visited other countries in Asia, including India, where Harpal was from, will know that dismantling feudalism is a wonderful, beautiful thing that should be done in more places. There's no country in human history that has done more than China has to alleviate poverty, to lift people out of poverty. It's gone from being one of the poorest and most technologically backward countries in the world to being a science and technology powerhouse, the world's only renewable energy superpower. So Harpal always defended actually existing socialism. He defended the history of the working class, and he fought resolutely against the Cold War propaganda campaign against it. As I said, we had no shortage of differences over the merits or lack thereof of China's socialist market economy, as Comrade Zhang alluded to earlier, over whether one should support the Labour Party under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, over whether or not Brexit was a neoliberal scam, etc., etc. Nonetheless, we agreed on the main issues, and I would like to think that in as much as I do useful political work today, Harpal informs that a great deal. So may he rest in power. Thank you very much.